The morning fog hung thick over Buckingham Palace as Detective Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his uniform for what he believed would be another routine day protecting the royal family. For 15 years, he had served as one of the most trusted members of the Royal Protection Unit, earning medals for his dedication and discretion. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his access to the most sensitive areas of the palace unmatched. Marcus had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, dreaming of serving his country. His father had been a police officer, his grandfather a soldier, and the Thompson family had always believed in duty above self. When Marcus was selected for the Royal Protection Unit at age 28, his family celebrated as if he had won the lottery. To them, protecting the crown was the highest honor imaginable. The palace corridors were familiar territory to Marcus. He knew every hidden passage, every security camera blind spot, and every door that required special clearance. His colleagues respected him, the senior royals trusted him, and he had never given anyone reason to doubt his integrity. But today would change everything. It started with a routine security briefing in the morning. Commander Harrison, head of Royal Security, had called an emergency meeting about new protocols for Queen Camilla's upcoming state dinner with the French president. The briefing room was packed with security personnel, palace staff, and senior advisors. Marcus sat in his usual spot near the back, taking notes on his tablet. "Gentlemen and ladies," Commander Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "Next week's dinner requires the highest level of security. We have credible intelligence suggesting potential threats from Republican activists." As Harrison continued outlining security measures, Marcus noticed something unusual. A woman in an expensive suit was whispering urgently to one of Queen Camilla's private secretaries. The woman looked agitated, constantly checking her phone and glancing around nervously. Marcus had been trained to notice behavioral anomalies, and this woman was displaying classic signs of distress. After the briefing, Marcus approached his colleague, Sergeant Williams, who had been working royal protection for 20 years. "Who was that woman talking to Pemberton?" he asked, referring to the Queen's secretary. Williams lowered his voice. "That's Victoria Sterling, one of the Queen's financial advisors. Word is she's been having private meetings with Her Majesty almost daily for the past month. Very hush-hush stuff." Marcus filed this information away, thinking little of it at the time. Royal finances were complex, and advisors often had urgent matters to discuss. But over the next few days, he began noticing patterns that troubled his trained investigative mind. Queen Camilla had been making unusual requests for private meetings in the Blue Drawing Room, a space typically used for state occasions. These meetings were not on any official schedule, and the usual protocol of having security present was being waived. Marcus discovered this when he was reassigned from his normal post to patrol the garden grounds during what should have been his shift protecting the Queen's private quarters. His curiosity piqued. Marcus began paying closer attention to the comings and goings around the Queen's private areas. He noticed that Victoria Sterling was indeed making frequent visits, always carrying a briefcase and often accompanied by men in expensive suits who were not on the palace's approved visitor list. One evening, while conducting his regular security rounds, Marcus discovered something that would haunt him for months to come. He was checking the locks on the staterooms when he heard voices coming from behind the closed doors of the Blue Drawing Room. The conversation was supposed to be private, but the old palace walls were thin, and sound carried easily through the corridors. "The foundation accounts need to be restructured immediately," he heard Victoria Sterling saying. "If the media discovers how the funds have been allocated, it could cause significant embarrassment." Queen Camilla's voice was harder to make out, but Marcus caught fragments. Charitable contributions, private expenses, no one can know. Marcus felt his stomach drop. As a police officer, he had been trained to recognize the language of financial impropriety. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with references to redirected funds, personal use, and covering the paper trail. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. Queen Camilla, the woman he had sworn to protect, appeared to be discussing the misuse of charitable funds. The royal family's charitable work was supposed to be beyond reproach, a cornerstone of their public service. If what he was hearing was true, It represented a betrayal of public trust on an unprecedented scale. That night, Marcus lay awake in his modest flat, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his conscience. His training as a police officer demanded that he investigate potential criminal activity, regardless of who was involved. But his oath to protect the royal family created a conflict that threatened to tear him apart. Over the following weeks, Marcus began documenting everything he observed. He noted dates, times, and the identities of everyone present at the mysterious meetings. He photographed documents that had been carelessly left on desks, and he recorded conversations when he could do so without being detected. What he discovered was far worse than he had initially feared. The charitable foundation that bore Queen Camilla's name, which raised millions of pounds annually for causes supporting literacy and domestic violence victims, had been systematically plundered. Funds designated for building women's shelters had been redirected to pay for the Queen's personal expenses, including lavish vacations disguised as royal tours and expensive jewelry purchases justified as representation costs. The most damning evidence came from a meeting he witnessed in early October. Victoria Sterling was presenting quarterly financial reports to Queen Camilla and two other advisors. Marcus had positioned himself in an alcove where he could observe without being seen. "The media attention on our literacy programs has been excellent," Sterling reported. "Donations are up 40% from last year. However, we've had to be creative with fund allocation to cover your Majesty's recent expenses." Queen Camilla nodded approvingly. "The public must never know that their donations are supporting anything other than the stated charitable purposes. Our reputation depends on maintaining that facade." One of the male advisors, whom Marcus later identified as financial consultant David Hartwell, spread several documents across the coffee table. "We've established a complex network of subsidiary accounts that make it virtually impossible to trace where the money actually goes. Even if someone requested an audit, it would take forensic accountants months to unravel the true financial picture." Marcus felt physically sick as he realized the scope of the deception. Millions of pounds that should have been helping vulnerable women and children were instead funding a lifestyle of extraordinary luxury for someone who was already among the wealthiest people in the world. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Marcus was on duty during a visit from representatives of the Sunshine Foundation, a charity that supported children with disabilities. The delegation had come to present Queen Camilla with a check for £200,000, money raised through the efforts of families who had very little to spare. Marcus watched as Queen Camilla graciously accepted the donation, speaking eloquently about her commitment to helping disadvantaged children. She posed for photographs, shook hands with the fundraisers, and promised that every penny would go directly to programs that would change young lives. Within hours of the delegation's departure, Marcus observed Victoria Sterling entering the blue drawing room with the check and leaving without it. Later that evening, he discovered documents indicating that the funds had been immediately transferred to an account used to pay for the Queen's upcoming private vacation to the Maldives. That night, Marcus made the most difficult decision of his life. He could no longer stand by and watch as charitable donations intended for the most vulnerable members of society were stolen to fund royal excess. His oath as a police officer superseded his loyalty to individuals, even those wearing crowns. Marcus began working with extraordinary care to build a comprehensive case. He knew that any allegations against the royal family would face intense scrutiny, and that his evidence would need to be absolutely irrefutable. He contacted his former colleagues at the Metropolitan Police, eventually connecting with Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, who specialized in financial crimes. Chen was initially skeptical when Marcus approached her through carefully arranged back channels. Accusations against the royal family were extremely serious, and false allegations could destroy careers and lives. But as Marcus presented his evidence, photographs, recordings, financial documents, and detailed timelines, Chen realized she was looking at one of the most significant royal scandals in modern British history. "This is explosive material," Chen told Marcus during one of their clandestine meetings in a quiet cafe in Greenwich. "If even half of what you've documented is accurate, we're looking at fraud on a massive scale. But you understand the implications of pursuing this?" Marcus nodded grimly. "I understand that my career is over either way. If I do nothing, I'm complicit in ongoing criminal activity. If I speak out, I'll be branded a traitor and probably never work in law enforcement again. But those donations were meant to help children and vulnerable women. I can't let this continue. Chen spent several weeks verifying Marcus's evidence through her own sources. She discovered additional documentation that supported his allegations and identified other potential witnesses who might be willing to testify. The case was solid, but both officers knew that pursuing it would require extraordinary courage. The decision to file a civil lawsuit rather than pursue criminal charges was strategic. Criminal proceedings against a member of the royal family would face numerous constitutional obstacles and could potentially be blocked by government intervention. A civil lawsuit, however, could proceed through the courts with less political interference. Marcus hired Amanda Richardson, one of London's most respected civil litigation attorneys, known for her willingness to take on powerful defendants and her meticulous preparation. Richardson spent months reviewing the evidence and consulting with financial experts to ensure that every aspect of the case was thoroughly documented. The lawsuit was filed on a cold December morning, seeking damages of £100 million, representing the estimated total amount of charitable funds that had been misappropriated over a 5-year period. The sum was staggering, but Richardson's calculations showed that it accurately reflected the scope of the alleged fraud. The initial filing was kept confidential, as is standard practice in high-profile cases. But news of the lawsuit leaked within days, sending shockwaves through the palace and beyond. The royal family's communications team went into crisis mode, while media outlets scrambled to understand the implications of the most serious allegations against the monarchy in generations. Marcus knew that his life would never be the same. He had crossed a line that few people in his position would dare to cross, challenging the institution he had spent his career serving. But as he looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, photographs of children with disabilities whose donations had been stolen, financial records showing millions diverted from charitable causes, recordings of conversations that revealed the callous attitudes of those involved, he felt certain that he had made the right choice. The palace's initial response was swift and predictable. A carefully worded statement denied all allegations and suggested that Marcus was a disgruntled employee seeking attention and financial gain. Character assassination attempts began within hours, with anonymous sources questioning Marcus's mental health, his financial situation, and his motives. But Marcus had prepared for this response. He had documented everything carefully, maintained copies of all evidence in secure locations, and worked with his legal team to anticipate every possible defense strategy. The truth, he believed, would ultimately prevail, regardless of the power and resources arrayed against him. As the first phase of the legal battle began, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had entered royal service as an idealistic young man who believed in duty, honor, and service to country. He was leaving it as someone who had learned that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The media storm that followed the leaked news of Marcus Thompson's lawsuit was unlike anything the royal family had faced since the death of Princess Diana. Within hours of the story breaking, news trucks lined the streets outside Buckingham Palace, and social media exploded with speculation about the allegations. The hashtag #DaughterRoyalFraud trending worldwide as people demanded answers about how their charitable donations had been used. Amanda Richardson's law offices became a fortress under siege. Reporters camped outside the building, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marcus or any member of his legal team. The phones rang constantly, with interview requests from news outlets around the globe. Richardson had handled high-profile cases before, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of international scrutiny that came with challenging the British monarchy. Inside the palace, panic was setting in among Queen Camilla's closest advisors. Victoria Sterling, the financial consultant who had orchestrated much of the alleged fraud, found herself at the center of a rapidly expanding investigation. Her carefully constructed web of subsidiary accounts and shell companies was beginning to unravel as forensic accountants hired by Marcus's legal team traced money flows across dozens of financial institutions. Sir Edmund Hartwell, the palace's chief legal counsel, convened emergency meetings to develop a defense strategy. The stakes could not have been higher. If the allegations were proven true, the damage to the monarchy's reputation would be catastrophic, potentially sparking Republican movements across the Commonwealth and undermining the institution's role in British society. "We need to discredit Thompson immediately," Hartwell told the assembled team of lawyers, public relations specialists, and palace officials. "Portray him as mentally unstable, financially desperate, or politically motivated. The public must see him as a traitor to the crown, not a whistleblower protecting charitable interests." The character assassination campaign against Marcus began in earnest. Anonymous sources leaked stories to tabloid newspapers claiming that he had been disciplined for inappropriate behavior, had financial problems that made him vulnerable to bribery, and had expressed Republican sympathies to colleagues. None of these claims were true, but the palace's media operation was sophisticated enough to make them appear credible to casual observers. Marcus watched the attacks on his character with a mixture of sadness and determination. He had expected this response and had prepared himself psychologically for the onslaught. More importantly, he had documented his exemplary service record, maintained detailed financial records proving his fiscal responsibility, and gathered character witnesses who could testify to his integrity and professionalism. His former colleague, Sergeant Williams, was one of the first to publicly defend him. Despite pressure from palace officials to remain silent, Williams gave an interview to the BBC describing Marcus as one of the most principled officers I've ever worked with, someone who would never make false allegations for personal gain. The support from his former colleagues was crucial, but Marcus knew that public opinion would ultimately be decided by the evidence rather than character testimonials. Richardson's legal team was working around the clock to prepare for the preliminary hearings, knowing that they would need to present compelling proof of their allegations to survive the inevitable motion to dismiss. The first major breakthrough came when Detective Inspector Sarah Chen's investigation uncovered additional witnesses within the palace staff. A housekeeping supervisor named Margaret Walsh had noticed irregularities in the Queen's private accounts and had kept detailed records of unusual financial activities she had observed. Walsh had worked at the palace for 30 years and had an impeccable reputation for honesty and attention to detail. Walsh's testimony was devastating to the palace's defense. She described observing Victoria Sterling entering the Queen's private study late at night, carrying bags of cash. Seeing expensive jewelry being delivered to the palace and immediately moved to private quarters rather than being catalogued as official gifts, and witnessing the destruction of financial documents that should have been preserved for auditing purposes. Even more damaging was the testimony of Thomas Pemberton, Queen Camilla's private secretary, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. Pemberton had initially been loyal to the Queen, but the weight of participating in what he now recognized as criminal activity had taken a severe toll on his conscience. "I was instructed to create false documentation showing that charitable funds were being used for their intended purposes," Pemberton revealed in a sealed deposition. "When I expressed concerns about the legality of these actions, I was told that loyalty to the crown meant following orders without question, regardless of personal moral qualms." Pemberton's testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme. Charitable donations were being layered through multiple accounts to obscure their ultimate destination. False receipts were being created to show expenditures on charitable programs that never actually existed. Independent auditors were being given fabricated financial reports that bore no resemblance to the actual movement of funds. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Over 5 years, an estimated £47 million in charitable donations had been diverted to personal use. This included funds raised for literacy programs, domestic violence shelters, children's hospitals, and disaster relief efforts. Money donated by school children, pensioners, and working families who had sacrificed to support causes they believed in had instead funded luxury vacations, expensive art purchases, and lavish entertainment expenses. One particularly damning piece of evidence emerged when investigators discovered that Queen Camilla had used charitable funds to purchase a thoroughbred racehorse worth £3 million. The transaction had been disguised as a donation to an equine therapy program for disabled children. But the horse had never been used for therapeutic purposes and remained in the Queen's private stable. As more evidence came to light, public opinion began to shift dramatically. Initial skepticism about Marcus's allegations gave way to outrage as people realized the extent to which their charitable giving had been betrayed. Petition drives began calling for Queen Camilla's abdication, and Republican sentiment reached levels not seen since the crisis following Princess Diana's death. The palace's defense strategy evolved as it became clear that complete denial was no longer sustainable. The new approach focused on minimizing Queen Camilla's personal involvement, portraying her as a victim of unscrupulous advisors who had misled her about the legal and ethical implications of their financial arrangements. Victoria Sterling became the primary scapegoat for the scandal. Palace sources leaked information suggesting that Sterling had manipulated the Queen, taking advantage of her trust to orchestrate the fraud for personal enrichment. This narrative was problematic because it required portraying the future Queen consort as naive and easily manipulated, hardly the image the monarchy wanted to project. Sterling, recognizing that she was being set up as a fall guy, decided to cooperate with Marcus's legal team in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution. Her insider knowledge of the fraud scheme provided investigators with a roadmap to every hidden account, every false document, and every illegal transaction. Queen Camilla was not a passive victim, Sterling testified in a dramatic court appearance. She was the architect of this scheme. Every major decision about how to divert charitable funds came directly from her. She would review detailed reports about which donations could be safely diverted without triggering public scrutiny. Sterling's testimony included recordings she had secretly made of meetings with Queen Camilla, insurance she had taken to protect herself if the scheme was ever discovered. The recordings captured the Queen's voice giving explicit instructions about how to steal charitable donations while maintaining plausible deniability. In one particularly damaging recording, Queen Camilla could be heard saying, "The public expects us to live in luxury, but they're too naive to understand that their small donations need to be supplemented by more creative financial arrangements. As long as we maintain the appearance of charitable work, we can justify the means necessary to support our lifestyle." The release of these recordings created a constitutional crisis. For the first time in modern British history, there was recorded evidence of a senior royal explicitly discussing criminal activity. Parliamentary leaders called for emergency sessions to discuss the monarchy's future, while legal experts debated whether Queen Camilla could be prosecuted under existing law. Marcus watched these developments with mixed emotions. He felt vindicated that his allegations were being proven true, but he also felt sadness at seeing an institution he had once revered being exposed as fundamentally corrupt. The royal family had represented stability and moral authority for centuries, but that image was crumbling as more details of the scandal emerged. The impact on charitable giving was immediate and severe. Donations to royal charities dropped by 80% as the public lost confidence in how their money would be used. Legitimate charitable organizations that had partnered with the royal family found themselves struggling to maintain funding as donors became suspicious of any connection to the monarchy. Queen Camilla's public appearances became increasingly rare as protests followed her wherever she went. The once respectful crowds that had greeted royal visits were replaced by angry demonstrators demanding accountability and justice. Security concerns forced the cancellation of most scheduled events, effectively ending her public role as a working royal. Behind the scenes, urgent discussions were taking place about damage control. Some advisors recommended that Queen Camilla step down from her charitable roles and make public restitution to the organizations that had been defrauded. Others argued that any admission of wrongdoing would create legal precedents that could threaten the entire monarchy. King Charles found himself in an impossible position. Supporting his wife would make him appear complicit in the fraud, but abandoning her would create a personal and institutional crisis that could threaten his reign. Palace sources reported that the king was struggling with the realization that the woman he loved had potentially committed crimes that betrayed the values he had spent his life promoting. The pressure on the monarchy intensified when other Commonwealth nations began questioning their continued recognition of the British crown. The prime ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about the allegations and suggesting that constitutional review might be necessary if the charges were proven true. As the legal proceedings continued, Marcus found himself becoming an reluctant public figure. His decision to speak out had made him a symbol of integrity for those who believed that no one should be above the law, regardless of their position or title. He received thousands of letters of support from ordinary citizens who praised his courage in challenging the powerful to protect the vulnerable. The transformation of Marcus from loyal royal protector to the monarchy's most dangerous critic was complete. The man who had once sworn to defend the crown with his life was now its most credible accuser, armed with evidence that threatened to bring down an institution that had survived world wars, economic crises, and social revolutions. The question now was whether the British legal system would have the courage to hold royalty accountable for crimes that would send ordinary citizens to prison. The answer would determine not only Queen Camilla's fate, but the future of the monarchy itself in the 21st century. The courtroom at the Royal Courts of Justice had never seen anything like it. Every seat was filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had queued for hours to witness what many considered the trial of the century. Security was unprecedented, with armed police stationed throughout the building and metal detectors at every entrance. The case of Thompson versus Her Majesty Queen Camilla would determine whether the British legal system truly applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their royal status. Judge Sir Malcolm Brennan, one of the most respected jurists in the country, had been selected to preside over the case precisely because of his reputation for fairness and his immunity to political pressure. At 72, Brennan had spent his career handling the most complex and sensitive cases in British law, but he privately acknowledged that nothing had prepared him for the constitutional implications of this trial. Marcus Thompson entered the courtroom wearing his dress uniform, a decision made by his legal team to emphasize his service record and credibility. He walked with the bearing of a career police officer, his head held high despite the weight of death threats and public scrutiny he had endured over the past months. Behind him sat Amanda Richardson and her team of attorneys, their tables stacked high with evidence that they claimed would prove the most serious allegations of royal corruption in modern British history. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Queen Camilla's legal team presented a stark contrast. Led by Sir Reginald Blackwood, the most expensive barrister in London, they projected an aura of old-money confidence that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge the established order. Queen Camilla herself was notably absent, choosing to be represented by counsel rather than face cross-examination that could potentially incriminate her further. The opening statement set the tone for what would become a 3-week legal battle that captivated the nation. Richardson rose first, her voice clear and unwavering, as she outlined the case against the Queen. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is not about politics or personal vendettas. It is about the systematic theft of charitable donations intended for the most vulnerable members of our society. Over the next several weeks, we will present evidence showing that Queen Camilla, aided by a network of advisors and financial consultants, deliberately diverted millions of pounds from charitable causes to fund her personal lifestyle." Richardson's opening was methodical and devastating. She outlined the paper trail that showed how donations for literacy programs had been used to purchase luxury vacations, how money raised for domestic violence shelters had funded expensive jewelry, and how contributions for children's hospitals had been diverted to art acquisitions. The jury listened with visible shock as the scope of the alleged fraud was laid out in detail. Sir Reginald Blackwood's response was predictable but forceful. He portrayed Marcus as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against an employer who had not promoted him as quickly as he believed he deserved. He suggested that the evidence had been fabricated or taken out of context, and that the allegations represented a dangerous attack on the constitutional monarchy that was the foundation of British society. "Mr. Thompson has violated the most sacred trust in British society," Blackwood argued. His oath of loyalty to the crown was not merely ceremonial, but represented a fundamental commitment to protect the institution that has provided stability to our nation for over 1,000 years. His betrayal of that trust should not be rewarded with financial compensation, but should be recognized for what it truly is: an act of treason motivated by greed and ambition. The first week of testimony focused on establishing Marcus's credibility and the authenticity of his evidence. His former colleagues testified about his exemplary service record, his reputation for honesty, and his dedication to his duties. The prosecution presented detailed forensic analysis of financial records, recordings, and documents that supported every aspect of Marcus's allegations. Victoria Sterling's testimony was the highlight of the first week. Despite death threats and attempts to discredit her, she provided hour-by-hour accounts of how the fraud scheme operated. Her secret recordings of Queen Camilla were played for the jury, creating moments of stunned silence as they heard the monarch's voice giving explicit instructions about how to divert charitable funds. The Queen was not a figurehead in this operation, Sterling testified. She reviewed every major transaction, approved every false document, and personally selected which charitable causes would be defrauded. She once told me that the public's emotional attachment to charity made them easy targets for financial manipulation. The defense team's cross-examination of Sterling was brutal, but largely ineffective. They attempted to portray her as a criminal seeking to reduce her own liability by falsely implicating the Queen. But the evidence she provided was too detailed and too well documented to be dismissed as fabrication. Thomas Pemberton's testimony was equally damaging. The Queen's former private secretary described in excruciating detail how he had been ordered to create false financial reports, destroy incriminating documents, and lie to auditors about how charitable funds were being used. His testimony revealed the institutional nature of the corruption, showing that multiple palace employees had been coerced into participating in criminal activity. "I was told that questioning the Queen's financial arrangements was tantamount to treason," Pemberton testified. The culture within the palace was such that any employee who raised ethical concerns would be immediately dismissed and blacklisted from future employment anywhere in the royal household. The second week of the trial focused on the victims of the alleged fraud. Representatives from charities that had been defrauded testified about the impact of losing millions of pounds in expected donations. The testimony was heartbreaking, as social workers described having to close women's shelters, education specialists talked about canceled literacy programs, and medical professionals explained how children's treatment had been delayed due to lack of funding. Margaret Walsh, the palace housekeeper who had witnessed many of the financial irregularities, provided crucial testimony about the Queen's personal involvement in the scheme. Her 30 years of service gave her testimony particular weight, and her obvious reluctance to testify against her former employer made her account even more credible. "I saw Her Majesty personally selecting jewelry that had been purchased with charitable funds," Walsh testified. She would examine each piece carefully, discussing with her advisors which occasions would be appropriate for wearing items bought with money donated by families who had very little to spare. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Sarah Martinez, whose 8-year-old daughter had raised money for a children's literacy program by selling handmade bracelets outside their local supermarket. The child had raised over £300, money that had subsequently been diverted to fund one of Queen Camilla's private dinners. "My daughter believed she was helping other children learn to read," Martinez testified through tears. "She worked every weekend for 6 months, standing outside in all weather because she wanted to make a difference. To learn that her money was used to buy expensive wine for a royal dinner party has destroyed her faith in both charity and the monarchy." The defense team's strategy became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against their client. They attempted to shift blame entirely onto Victoria Sterling and other advisors, arguing that Queen Camilla had been manipulated and deceived by unscrupulous employees who had betrayed her trust. This approach backfired spectacularly when Richardson played recordings that clearly showed Queen Camilla giving detailed instructions about how to structure fraudulent transactions. In one particularly damaging exchange, the Queen could be heard laughing about how gullible charitable donors were and joking about their naive faith in royal integrity. The third week of the trial brought expert testimony from forensic accountants who had analyzed the financial records. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Over £47 million in charitable donations had been systematically diverted over a 5-year period, with Queen Camilla's personal accounts being the ultimate destination for the vast majority of the funds. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a leading expert in charity fraud, testified that the scheme represented the most sophisticated and extensive abuse of charitable trust in British history. Her analysis showed that the fraud had been carefully planned to avoid detection, with transactions structured to fall just below reporting thresholds and documentation created to provide plausible explanations for suspicious activities. The defense team's final strategy was to argue that even if the allegations were true, the court lacked jurisdiction to hold a member of the royal family accountable for their actions. This constitutional argument was immediately challenged by Richardson, who cited numerous precedents showing that royal immunity was limited and did not extend to criminal behavior. Judge Brennan's ruling on the jurisdictional question was swift and decisive. "The principle that no person is above the law is fundamental to British justice," he declared. "Royal status may provide certain ceremonial privileges, but it does not create immunity from the consequences of criminal behavior." Queen Camilla's absence from the trial became a major issue during closing arguments. Richardson argued that her refusal to testify demonstrated consciousness of guilt and showed contempt for the legal process. If Queen Camilla were innocent of these charges, she would be here defending her reputation and her actions. Her absence speaks louder than any testimony she might provide. Blackwood countered that the Queen's absence was appropriate, given the politically motivated nature of the charges, and that requiring her to submit to cross-examination would undermine the dignity of the monarchy. This argument fell flat with the jury, who seemed offended by the suggestion that some people were too important to be held accountable for their actions. The jury deliberations lasted 4 days, during which London was gripped by speculation about the outcome. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, while social media tracked every rumored development. The case had become a referendum on the future of the monarchy, with Republicans calling for abolition and monarchists hoping for vindication of their beloved institution. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was so silent that the sound of papers rustling seemed deafening. The foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Henderson, stood to deliver the decision that would reshape British society. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Thompson, and award damages in the amount of £100 million. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the full implications of the verdict sank in. Queen Camilla had been found liable for the largest charity fraud in British history, and the jury had awarded the maximum damages requested by the prosecution. The monetary award was largely symbolic, as it was unlikely to be collected, but the legal precedent was revolutionary. Judge Brennan struggled to restore order as reporters rushed to file their stories and spectators cheered or protested the decision. When quiet was finally restored, he delivered additional remarks that would be quoted in constitutional law textbooks for generations to come. This verdict demonstrates that British justice applies equally to all citizens, regardless of their birth, title, or position. The jury has determined that charitable fraud is criminal behavior that cannot be excused by royal status or institutional position. Marcus Thompson sat quietly as the verdict was read, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. He had proven his allegations and held the powerful accountable for their actions, but he had also contributed to the potential destruction of an institution that had provided stability to British society for centuries. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced a crowd of journalists and supporters. His statement was brief but powerful. This case was never about destroying the monarchy or seeking personal enrichment. It was about protecting vulnerable people who trust charitable organizations with their donations. No one, regardless of their title or position, should be allowed to steal from those who have the least in order to fund a lifestyle of luxury and excess. The immediate aftermath of the verdict created a constitutional crisis that threatened the very foundation of the British monarchy. Parliament was recalled for emergency sessions to discuss the implications of a sitting royal being found liable for criminal behavior. Republican movements gained momentum across the Commonwealth as citizens questioned whether hereditary privilege was compatible with democratic values. Queen Camilla issued a brief statement through her representatives, expressing disappointment with the verdict and announcing her intention to appeal. However, the damage to her reputation and to the monarchy as a whole was irreversible. Public opinion polls showed that support for the royal family had dropped to historic lows, with a majority of citizens under 40 expressing support for Republican government. The case of Thompson versus Queen Camilla would be remembered as the moment when the modern British monarchy was forced to confront the reality that royal privilege could no longer shield criminal behavior from legal consequences. Marcus Thompson, the loyal royal protector turned whistleblower, had achieved something that Republicans and constitutional reformers had been unable to accomplish for centuries. He had proven that in 21st century Britain, no one was truly above the law. The £100 million judgment would likely never be collected, but its symbolic impact was immeasurable. The verdict established legal precedent that would forever change the relationship between the crown and the people, ensuring that future generations would inherit a more accountable and transparent system of government. As Marcus walked away from the courthouse, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from loyal servant to institutional challenger. The cost had been enormous: his career, his privacy, and his simple faith in the system he had once served without question. But the principle he had defended was worth the sacrifice: that justice must be blind to privilege, and that protecting the vulnerable requires the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal consequences.